In its final weeks, the presidential race of 1968 was neck and neck. High-level leaks from a secret source indicated that as Election Day neared, Democratic President Lyndon Johnson was suddenly working very hard to end the war in Vietnam. Republican candidate Richard Nixon feared that the president was going to come up with an October surprise that would bring peace to Southeast Asia and help Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, win the election. It was then that Richard Nixon turned to Anna Chennault, the widow of flying Tiger ace Claire Chennault, and now a powerful Washington hostess, known to her detractors as the Dragon Lady. Recently declassified files indicate that Madame Chennault worked aggressively to sabotage the peace talks by urging South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu to resist negotiating with the Communists. If the South Vietnamese held out, Chennault promised, a Republican administration would secure them a better deal.
We can never tell whether or not this did lose the election for Humphrey, but the fact is that Nixon was willing to engage in this clandestine secret operation, which was probably illegal.
Good evening, my fellow Americans.
The tactic may have worked. When Lyndon Johnson ordered a bombing halt on October 31st in order to lure the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table, the South Vietnamese dampened the public's hopes by opposing the peace talks.
This is one of the great and still untold scandals in American political history, because you had someone who was a private citizen negotiate directly with the president of a country in which the United States had already committed some 525,000 troops abroad.
Richard Nixon won the election. The very first person he appointed to his cabinet was the secret source who had leaked the information about Lyndon Johnson's sudden peace efforts, Henry Kissinger. While it's not clear that President Johnson would have been successful in bringing peace to Vietnam, the South Vietnamese were no better off when Nixon concluded his own peace negotiations than they would have been in 1968. In those 4 intervening years, 20,000 Americans and an uncalculated number of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians lost their lives. It was a pattern that would repeat itself. Nixon's concern that his opponents were concealing something drove him to resort to clandestine tactics to uncover their secrets and seize the advantage.
Nixon was a very complicated man. I think he was an outstanding president. I respected the decisions he made, which were very courageous. He was a dedicated patriot. He had a number of personality aspects which complicated his life and his conduct of the presidency.
Complicated as his life may have become, his beginnings were simple. Richard Milhous Nixon was born in Yorba Linda, California in 1913. His mother raised him in the Quaker faith while his father worked him long hours in the family grocery store. Although he earned a scholarship to Harvard University, he opted to stay at home and attend Whittier College. Determination and hard work also earned him a degree from Duke Law School. After his graduation, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor jolted the United States into World War II, and then Richard Nixon joined the Navy. As a supply officer in the South Pacific, he discovered a new side of himself.
And he taught himself to play poker, not for the fun of it, but in order to make money. As a Quaker, he should perhaps not have wanted to gamble, but he learned that these men who didn't necessarily expect to live would take all sorts of risks. And he learned to play a very conservative, reasoned game of poker.
At war's end, Richard Nixon parlayed his poker winnings to help finance his first political campaign, running against Democratic U.S. Congressman Jerry Voorhees. He won the election and soon made a name for himself as a vocal anti-communist on the House Un-American Activities Committee. 2 years later, in 1948, he faced Helen Gahagan Douglas in a bitterly contested race for the U.S. Senate seat in California.
He engaged in a bare-knuckles campaign, and this included, releasing documents about her voting record that associated her with the one communist-leaning member of the House of Representatives, but in ways that were misleading and inaccurate.
It was during that campaign that Helen Gahagan Douglas coined the nickname Tricky Dick. Nixon was quick to respond in kind.
More consistent in resisting communist aggression in Korea.
He said of Mrs. Douglas, she is pink all the way down to her underwear, which didn't seem very chivalrous, actually.
Once in the Senate, Nixon began to investigate the communist leanings of a debonair State Department official named Alger Hiss. Based on circumstantial evidence supplied by informant Whittaker Chambers, Nixon accused Hiss of lying under oath and espionage. Chambers produced papers and microfilm long hidden in a hollowed-out pumpkin to support his claim that Hiss had copied classified documents and passed them on to the Soviets. Hiss steadfastly maintained his innocence, but Nixon called his bluff. He was willing to gamble his entire career on his instinct that Hiss was guilty. After one trial ended in a hung jury, Hiss was convicted of perjury and sent to prison. Nixon's dogged determination earned him a position of prominence within the Republican Party and the lifelong enmity of his Democratic opponents. He was so popular among conservative Republicans that at only 38 years of age, he was recruited to become Dwight Eisenhower's running mate in the presidential election of 1952. The Eisenhower-Nixon ticket won a landslide victory, but in spite of their political success, Eisenhower always maintained a comfortable distance from his young vice president.
Eisenhower, I don't think, ever cottoned to him, ever really got to like him. One might have hoped, and I think Nixon hoped, that maybe they could have had a kind of father-son relationship, or that Nixon could have become his protege in some way. But it never worked out that way.
In 1955, when French legions were fighting to maintain their control over Vietnam, Nixon was an advocate of the secret Project Vulture. It called for dropping atomic bombs on Viet Minh forces at Dien Bien Phu. Eisenhower, however, rejected the plan. In spite of the fact that Richard Nixon worked hard to win Ike's approval, the president considered dropping him off the 1956 ticket. Although Ike's lack of enthusiasm undermined his confidence, Nixon carried on. During his second term as vice president, he distinguished himself by traveling the world to build new ties with foreign dignitaries, always making sure to report his impressions to President Eisenhower. In 1960, Richard Nixon won the Republican nomination and faced John F. Kennedy in a close race. The final insult to Nixon's pride occurred when Eisenhower seemed reluctant to endorse his candidacy.
reporters asked Eisenhower, can you name a major decision where Nixon's advice was decisive? And Eisenhower said, give me a week and I'll think of one. And that was widely viewed as being dismissive of him.
Eisenhower did finally endorse his vice president, but it was too late. For Richard Nixon, defeat at the hands of John Kennedy was a bitter blow. For his wife Pat, the break from the demands of political life was like a vacation. It would be another 8 years before Nixon would return to national politics, this time as a victor. In the intervening years, the United States entered into a war that had become increasingly unpopular. It would prove to be a conflict that would further enmesh Richard Nixon in a web of secrecy. Richard Nixon had spent most of his adult life in politics, had reached full maturity while in the White House, and had spent long hours dreaming about the goals he would achieve as president. As he entered office in 1969, the tensions of the Cold War still loomed on the horizon, presenting ever greater and unknown threats that included nuclear arms and a vast array of deadly chemical and biological weapons. But all this seemed to pale in juxtaposition to a conflict that raged on the other side of the world. America's involvement in Vietnam had begun under President Eisenhower, and by 1968 had escalated into an undeclared and unpopular war. During his campaign, Richard Nixon hinted to the voters that he had a secret plan to end the fighting and bring U.S. soldiers home. During his first days in office, he promised peace with honor in Vietnam. The man he chose to help him accomplish this feat was his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. Although quite different in style, the two were destined to forge a profoundly important relationship. Kissinger believed it was because he had found an effective way to work with his boss.
He could not confront people directly and tell them he disagreed with them. He could do it by paper. So one reason our relationship thrived is we'd spent a lot of time together, but all the important decisions were made on the basis of memos. Since he was so much on guard all the time, it was not easy to have a personal relationship with him.
In spite of Nixon's inability to let his guard down, he and Kissinger were so close that others in the State Department, including Melvin Laird, his Secretary of Defense, and William Rogers, his Secretary of State, were shut out of the policy-making loop. When it came to strategizing about the war in Vietnam, the President and Kissinger made all the decisions.
They just fed off of each other, I think, in a way that was really unhealthy. But the negative characteristics they shared was this kind of paranoid sense that there was something out there or someone out there out to get them in one way or another.
President Nixon's plan to end the war included Vietnamization, which called for the slow withdrawal of American ground troops from Vietnam, while the South Vietnamese learned to survive on their own. The plan angered the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who thought Nixon was going soft on communism.
What we don't really fully appreciate, even today, is the intense and depth of dislike of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our top military officials, of Nixon's foreign policy.
Frustrated that they'd been shut out of the decision-making process, the Joint Chiefs decided to engage in a clandestine operation of their own.
An admiral named Robert Waylander ordered a yeoman named Charles Radford to spy on the National Security Council, to pilfer records, to wiretap on one occasion, but largely simply to take documents and Xerox them.
Unaware that this secret spy operation was underway, President Nixon was working hard to appease his military commanders by taking a bold and violent step. In hopes of sending a clear message to Hanoi, President Nixon agreed to a secret plan to bomb North Vietnamese targets in Cambodia. Within 2 months of becoming president and promising to bring a quick end to the war, Nixon approved a massive B-52 bombing strike, codenamed Menu.
A deliberate effort was made to prevent the American public, especially, from knowing, Congress from knowing, and even the Secretary of the Air Force from knowing that the bombing was taking place. Why? Because there would have been an uproar against him.
The B-52 bombers carried immense cargoes of high explosives designed for saturation bombing over a wide area. They flew at an altitude too high to be observed by North Vietnamese moving along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Melvin Laird, Secretary of Defense during the first Nixon administration, worried whether enough precautions were being taken to minimize the risk of striking civilian centers. Between March of 1969 and May of 1970, over 3,000 raids were flown across the Cambodian frontier. Bombing surveys after the war estimate that hundreds of thousands of civilians lost their lives. At the same time that the U.S. Air Force was dropping bombs on Cambodia, peace negotiations were underway in Paris. Some of the talks were formal negotiations carried out in public. Other talks were held in the strictest secrecy.
Most of the serious work was done in the private talks, because in the public talks, each side repeated their well-known positions.
An aura of intrigue surrounded the secret peace negotiations. Anthony Lake, assistant to Henry Kissinger, was there.
This was a way of life, to keep secrets away from everybody. So when we traveled over, we would go under assumed names to fly over. When we were flying over to Paris, I was Major Larkin. Kissinger was Colonel, somebody that began with a K. And we would drive around Paris in cars with curtains drawn, et cetera, et cetera.
The talks were so secretive that for the first several months, members of the U.S. State Department did not even know that private negotiations were taking place.
This put me in a very difficult position because I was a State Department officer. Many of them were my friends, and I felt some real embarrassment not being able to tell them what we were actually doing, which is not the way to run a railroad.
A feeling of paranoia so pervaded Henry Kissinger's office that members of his own staff began to suspect that their phones were being tapped.
There were many rumors at the time that telephones were being tapped. Most of the rumors were about taps on telephones in offices. There were some rumors and even occasionally some evidence of taps on home telephones.
In spite of the administration's attempts to keep the lid on their secret policies, stories continued to leak out.
Henry Kissinger mistrusted virtually everyone who worked for him, so one of the reasons the taps were installed was to find out who was leaking material to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and he believed someone on his staff was doing that, and he had to find out who it was.
President Nixon believed the leaks were contributing to the domestic unrest that continued to grow unabated throughout the nation. Within a year after entering office, he had begun to think of himself as a man under siege, and as such, he was prepared to strike back. By 1969, in America, the movement to end the war in Vietnam had turned violent. During his first year in office, Nixon was aware that over 3,000 bombings against U.S. government property were under investigation. Even for the most level-headed individual, the pressure would have been hard to bear. As it was, a siege mentality prevailed within the White House.
Nixon at his core was an insecure man, a lonely man, a man in search always of approval from others, a man who, no matter how much success he ever achieved, it would never be enough inside of him.
In order to neutralize his many opponents, President Nixon continued several domestic surveillance programs that had been initiated by his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson. One of these secret programs, called CONUS, was conducted by the Army in order to spy on American civilians who seemed to have subversive ideas. Another was the clandestine Operation Chaos, run by the CIA.
The object was to infiltrate student groups, especially anti-war groups, to investigate professors who were conducting research that was negative perhaps about any aspect of American foreign policy, but especially the war.
Thousands of miles away in the jungles of South Vietnam, a CIA counterinsurgency program was underway. Under the auspices of a secret operation called Phoenix, U.S. Army advisors were training the South Vietnamese military, police, and civilians to root out Viet Cong intelligence agents who had infiltrated their villages. The CIA referred to its activities under Phoenix by the euphemistic term pacification.
One of the important components was assassination, and it's been estimated to have killed at least 20,000 alleged Viet Cong. So the objective was to identify, interrogate, arrest, or neutralize, the word was, to kill Viet Cong infrastructure.
By CIA standards, Phoenix was an unqualified success, but for many others, far too many innocent people were caught in the crossfire.
And you can imagine in an operation in which the objective is to arrest, interrogate, incarcerate without due process of law, the ratio of mistakes could be very high, given all the factors that operate.
During the first years of Nixon's presidency, the administration was also working hard to win the release of American prisoners of war, incarcerated in several Hanoi prisons. These efforts were certainly warranted, since reports indicated that many of these POWs had been subjected to years of solitary confinement and torture at the hands of their captors. But Nixon's critics suggest there might also have been an ulterior motive behind the administration's effort to win their freedom.
Nixon and Kissinger exploited the issue politically by trying to use the POW issue as a wedge with the growing anti-war movement in the country. And so the return of the American prisoners of war was elevated to a massive public relations game at the highest level to protect the legacy in their mind of peace with honor.
Then, in the fall of 1969, a story broke that threatened to turn into a true public relations nightmare. First called Pinkville and later the My Lai Massacre, the story involved the alleged cover-up of atrocities committed by American soldiers during the conduct of war. 24-year-old Lieutenant William Calley was accused of ordering the men in his platoon to slaughter over 100 innocent men, women, and children in the hamlet of My Lai. The subsequent court-martial of Lieutenant Calley further divided an already embattled country and called into question the Army's policy of search and destroy, which measured success by numbers of enemy killed. When Calley was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, the President ordered that he be released from the stockade at Fort Benning, pending a review of his case. He was confined to an apartment on the base until Nixon indicated that no further action was appropriate. In 1975, after serving only 3 years of his sentence, Calley was paroled, to the delight of his supporters. Two years after entering office, President Nixon was no closer to delivering on his promise to secure peace with honor in Vietnam. And to his great consternation, more trouble was about to erupt, this time in his own hemisphere. In the fall of 1970, democratic elections brought the Marxist Salvador Allende to power in Chile. American business interests and officials in the Nixon White House viewed the situation with alarm. Within 2 weeks after Allende's electoral victory, Nixon called a meeting with Richard Helms, then director of the CIA, with a view towards destabilizing the Chilean economy.
We have the very famous notes that Richard Helms took of this meeting in the afternoon of September 15th, 1970, where Nixon says, "Make the economy scream. Use our best men. Take $10,000. Don't tell the ambassador in Chile what we're actually doing. Foment a coup. Do whatever it takes." This was the marching orders for the CIA to overthrow Chilean democracy by hook or by crook.
Nixon told his advisors a little anecdote to explain his rationale for overthrowing the Allende government.
He says, look, you have communism in the Caribbean, in Cuba. Now you are going to have communism on the mainland of Latin America. You have a red sandwich in Latin America, and pretty soon it will all be red.
It soon became apparent that in order for a coup to succeed, the CIA needed the support of the Chilean military, then under the command of General René Schneider. But General Schneider was adamantly opposed to any meddling in the electoral process. CIA cable traffic indicates that Henry Kissinger authorized a covert operation aimed at removing General Schneider from power.
What the CIA did, under pressure from Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, was run around and look for a handful of disgruntled mid-level Chilean commanders and try and push them to foment a coup. They would kidnap René Schneider, blame it on the left in Chile. This would create, massive opposition to Allende, and the military would be able to take power, abrogate the election, and simply move on from there.
During September and October of 1970, CIA operatives in Chile recruited 2 different right-wing extremist gangs to kidnap General Schneider. Cables between CIA officials in Santiago and Kissinger's office document that the CIA supplied the kidnappers with gas grenades, machine guns, and ammunition. On October 22, 1970, a squad under the command of General Roberto Villa shot and killed General Schneider during a botched kidnapping attempt. A recently declassified CIA report shows that after the arrest and conviction of these men, the CIA paid $35,000 in hush money to help their families relocate. Kissinger believes that the administration's actions can only be understood within the context of Cold War politics.
First of all, every previous president, Kennedy and Johnson, were also determined that Allende did not become president, and they spent a lot more money in Chile to prevent it than Nixon did. The Cold War was not a tea party, and Nixon did not want another Soviet base in the Western Hemisphere, which he thought Allende would facilitate.
Allende managed to hold on to power, but for the next 3 years, the Nixon administration and the CIA conducted a covert operation against the Chilean government, codenamed Project Fubelt. The secret program was designed to destabilize the economy and included erecting an invisible economic blockade against Chile. Then on September 11, 1973, the very day that Henry Kissinger was going through his own Senate confirmation process as Secretary of State, right-wing General Augusto Pinochet led an assault on the presidential palace. Hours later, when soldiers entered the presidential office, they discovered the corpse of Salvador Allende with a bullet hole through his head. His death was reported to be a suicide. Days later, United States senators were told by a State Department official that the Nixon White House had advance warning of the coup, but decided on a hands-off policy. Recently released documents have established that the administration was immediately sympathetic to Augusto Pinochet's new regime.
The Nixon administration embraced this cutthroat military dictatorship, helped it consolidate and stay in power for what became 17 years of dictatorship.
While the Chilean coup may have stopped the spread of communism, it did so at a heavy toll. For nearly 2 decades, death squads swept the country, kidnapping and murdering thousands of Chilean citizens. But by 1973, Richard Nixon had so many problems of his own that he had little time to concern himself over human rights violations in Chile. The president's excessive concern about leaks reached such a high level that it led him to authorize illegal acts which would lead to the unraveling of his own administration. By the start of Nixon's 3rd year in office, his policy of Vietnamization seemed to be succeeding as the numbers of U.S. troops in Southeast Asia were reduced. On June 12, 1971, the president celebrated the happy occasion of his daughter Tricia's wedding. All seemed to be going well until the next morning. On the front page of the New York Times, next to Tricia's wedding pictures, was another headline. A Vietnam Archive Pentagon study traces 3 decades of growing U.S. involvement. Soon to be known around the world as the Pentagon Papers, it was the first installment of a 7,000-page report that investigated how the United States had become mired in Vietnam. Nixon's initial reaction to the paper's publication was fairly cool, since he felt that the report had the potential for damaging the reputations of his Democratic predecessors. But the president's nonchalance soon turned to unbridled rage when he realized that someone had leaked classified information to the New York Times. He and Henry Kissinger claimed that delicate diplomacy involving the Chinese, the Russians, and the North Vietnamese had been put in jeopardy.
We were concerned what other countries would think if they could not rely on our ability to maintain the confidentiality of our exchanges. There's no doubt that Nixon overdid his reaction. But like most of the things he overdid, there was more talk than action.
President Nixon soon learned that the culprit behind the leaks was a RAND consultant and former student of Henry Kissinger's named Daniel Ellsberg. Once an ardent supporter of U.S. intervention in Vietnam, Ellsberg was now convinced the conflict was futile. He dismissed Nixon's Vietnamization policy as a bloody and hopeless protraction of the war. Nixon's pursuit of Ellsberg soon became a vendetta. Nixon tried to discredit Ellsberg by recruiting J. Edgar Hoover to dig up dirt on him. When Hoover assigned a low priority to the project, Nixon confided to advisers that it was time for the elderly FBI director to retire. Nixon then took a step that would seal his fate. He established a secret investigative unit under the direction of his aide John Ehrlichman, which would respond directly to the Oval Office. The new group would soon be working out of the basement in the Executive Office building, with a sign in the door that read, "Mr. Young, Plumber."
The Plumbers Group was designed to plug leaks. That's why they have the name Plumbers. They decided to use the plumbers then in its first illegal black bag job by breaking into the office of the psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg. So they were planning simply to damage his reputation in every way, shape, form they could find.
On September 3, 1971, John Ehrlichman authorized the plumber's burglary of the Los Angeles office of Dr. Lewis Fielding in hopes of obtaining Ellsberg's psychiatric files.
The incident, in essence, led to the illegal operation of the plumbers unit within the White House. So it's crucial in terms of the beginning of the end of the Nixon administration's legal activities in opposition to its enemies.
In hindsight, those closest to Nixon believed that the president was his own worst enemy, a man who often had to be protected from his first impulses.
When I found out about that category of things, which was when it became public, I asked an old friend of Nixon's, I said, "What do you think happened here?" And he said, "Some damn fool went into the Oval Office and did what he was told." When those sorts of things, I was amazed and shocked. They were senseless. They were unworthy of a president.
What was worthy of presidential conduct were the steps that Nixon took to reduce the tensions of the Cold War. In 1971, he showed the wisdom to unilaterally ban the research and development of offensive biological weapons.
Of deadly biological weapons.
During his first term in office, Richard Nixon worked in concert with Henry Kissinger to achieve détente with the Soviet Union. Engaging in secret back-channel negotiations with the Soviets, the President and his national security advisor sidestepped both the Congress and NATO to negotiate an anti-ballistic missile agreement and a strategic arms limitation treaty. And with Kissinger's assistance, Nixon opened a dialogue with Communist China that culminated in his highly touted visit to that country in 1972.
In foreign policy, he was extremely innovative with respect to dealing with China and the Soviet Union because he wanted to conduct the Cold War in a different manner, leave containment behind and try to figure out a new operational mode for dealing with these two gigantic countries. And that will be forever to his credit.
But by the summer of 1973, Nixon's ultimate fate was no longer in his hands. A scandal caused by the plumbers, his own secret investigative unit, had begun to consume most of his time and energy. Often, Henry Kissinger, now Secretary of State, was left alone to deal with international crises like the Arab attack on Israel in the fall of 1973.
As a policymaker, you're always overwhelmed with decisions, so you react more like an athlete. You do not have the choice of changing your mind, because what you do tends to be irrevocable. In crisis, most people are in foxholes, throwing out an occasional memo that they're not responsible, and only 2 or 3 people who emerge who are willing to make decisions.
At the Paris peace table, Nixon's negotiators were secretly laying the groundwork for a surprising settlement. In 1973, they succeeded in negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam.
We today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
Nixon and Kissinger claimed that they had fulfilled their promise to bring peace with honor because they were leaving the Saigon regime secure and independent.
And that was their claim, that the U.S. could withdraw knowing it had made the Saigon regime strong enough to survive. Now, what's questionable, and I think false about that claim, if one looks at the record, is that there were parts to the agreement which, in the long run, would result in the fall of the Saigon regime, and Nixon and Kissinger knew this was the case.
The part of the agreement that was so astonishing was that Nixon and Kissinger agreed to let over 100,000 North Vietnamese troops remain on South Vietnamese soil. To many, this virtually ensured the subsequent fall of the Saigon government. Some historians suggest that Nixon and Kissinger may have had a secret motive in agreeing to this aspect of the treaty.
How are you going to keep your ally, President II, from seeing this as a betrayal? Well, one of the things you're going to do is you're going to guarantee to President II that as soon as those troops in the South make their first move, which everyone knew they would, we're going to bring back the B-52s and we're going to punish the North Vietnamese like they've never been punished before.
If President Nixon did have a plan to return U.S. air power to Vietnam, that plan was to be derailed by a cataclysmic succession of events known as Watergate. As it was, Richard Nixon no longer held public office by the time the Saigon government fell into communist hands in 1975. From the moment the plumbers were apprehended while pilfering files at the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate apartments, Nixon's presidency began its slow collapse. By 1974, his critics clamored for him to resign.
I think he achieved a great deal. The night before he left office, I told him, I said, history will treat you better than your contemporaries. I believe that is true.
On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon appeared before his staff to bid farewell before he resigned as President of the United States.
Always, you will be in our hearts, and you will be in our prayers. Thank you very much.
The dream that guided his adult life was over. Nixon's obsessive desire to learn the secrets of others was his undoing. For the time being, at least, much of what he'd accomplished in public life was overshadowed by scandal.